yeah, but I don't feel like he's treating me like a son, and before he was treating me like a daughter. I think I've just always been his kid, and it wasn't a super gendered treatment. It's just love and loving me as a soul.
You know, when I have conversations with others outside of my family about the transition that Kieran had made, I've always got his back. I've always, tried to put it in a positive way and for example, how much happier he is now being his authentic self.
Welcome in to Menfolk Journeys, the podcast of great conversations with men. I'm your host, Chris Foster, and we're going to explore how we wear this beautiful and confusing mantle of manhood in the 21st century. Look, I get it. In public life, a lot of men are knuckleheads. But in private life, we can be thoughtful and we can be reflective if we have the right conversation, if we feel comfortable talking about our story. And we all have a great story to tell. And we can all learn from those stories. We can learn about who we've been, who we are, and who we want to be. And that's why we're going to have this conversation, so we can learn from other men just like us. And we're going to have a conversation with KJ and Scott. As you heard in the intro, this is about a transition. This is not a political or social conversation. This is a relationship conversation about a child and his father, a father and his child, and how they both transitioned in a place of love during a time of change. I hope you listen to this conversation with an open mind and a wide heart so we can learn from their journey and get a little better ourselves. Welcome in to Menfolk Journeys. All right, so Scott and KJ, welcome in.
Thanks, Chris, for having us.
Yeah, thank you.
Absolutely. So Scott, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself, and then we'll have KJ.
Okay, my name's Scott Sutton. I'm 60 years old. I'm a dad of 2 adult children, and I live with my wife in San Diego, California, with 2 cats. I was born in Boulder, Colorado, but lived in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and then grew up in Boise, Idaho. And we had talked about that in an earlier podcast, which I would refer to if folks want to know a little bit more about me. I would just refer back to that podcast, which was The Science of Uncertainty.
Excellent. KJ?
Hi, I'm KJ. I am 22 years old. I live with 4 roommates who are my best friends, and my cat Tofu, who is cute and a little bit evil. And I was born in San Diego, and I live in Bellingham, Washington right now, which is a small town just a little bit north of Seattle.
Excellent. Well, thanks so much for being in here, fellas. And this is our first father-son episode. And KJ, for transparency, has transitioned to sonhood. And I think I'd like to start on that because the transitions happen not just for you and for family, but transitions happen in all of our lives. So I think, Scott, you as father, and KJ, you as son, were both going through different transitions. Scott, you had mentioned that transitioning as this somewhat older adult, but it's a multifaceted role as a father and a scientist and a husband, all while personally needing kind of these pockets of solitude to recharge and to regroup as so you can move along and support all these other aspects of your life. Meanwhile, KJ, you were going through a transition of identity and kind of learning about yourself. And one of the things that I find interesting, because this happens in families, is that families are supposed to be the sanctuary and the safety place that you go to. But oftentimes we don't have these deep conversations about our own personal transitions. Why do you think that is? And I guess, KJ, I'll start with you. When did you start feeling that you needed to be someone that you transitioned into? And how did you end up talking to your family about that?
Yeah, Chris, that's a great question. I guess I'll start with talking about, why it is so challenging, I think, to go through those transitions with your family and with the support of them. Because I feel like family, the people that are closest to us, can actually have the most preconceived notions about who we are. So it can be really scary to go through that transition and share with people that you've known for years and years that you're different than the person that you thought they might be. Um, and also with growth-based transitions, I think it can be hard, at least for me, to acknowledge like mistakes I've made and the ways that I've hurt people and the ways that I've grew from that. And then in terms of transitioning gender-wise, I think I decided I had to go through a personal journey first of figuring out who exactly I was and reconnect with myself before I shared that with my family. So I think that personal journey was important before I came out. And I think when I did come out, the way that I shared that with my family was an extremely long letter. I think there might have been some things before that, ways that I came out, but I found that I needed to express myself in a very long letter and just give like basically this whole narrative, leaving no room for like misunderstanding. And I sent that to my family and just gave them time to process it. And it also gave me the time and security to let them have that time to process it and not have to deal with that first reaction that might be one of fear. And not like might react in a way that you're not proud of, so.
Yeah, I want to pause on that real quick, KJ. I didn't know that. And I think that that is an extraordinarily mature thing to do, but I also think it's a very wise thing to do. People can read letters at their own pace. They can hear the voice of the person speaking with a cadence in their own mind rather than trying to pay attention to what somebody's saying. They can reread, right? When you're talking to somebody and you disclose something so dramatic, it's very hard for people to process the information coming in because they're processing what you have said while you're still saying something else, and they can't quite catch up. And so they lose the thread or they lose the important steps of your thinking. For you to write a letter for such a momentous and dramatic moment in your life and all of your life, I think was prescient and extraordinarily mature. And like I said, and a very wise thing because it gives people the room to respond. So firstly, well done you on that choice. And I guess, Scott, I would ask as dad, I'm sure you remember when you read the letter. What was that like?
Wow, it was a little bit surprising to me, but it was also at the same time a relief because we could tell something was up, something wasn't quite right, and that there was a lot going on with KJ, and to find out that it was this transition was probably along the lists of where or the spectrum of where a parent's imagination can stretch to. This was definitely not a bad thing. It was a good thing, and so I think we embraced it with some somewhat of relief, as well as, okay, now we need to support and be affirming of this transition.
Mm-hmm. No, that's a wonderful way for a family to respond. In the past, in other families, it might not be like that. I guess I would ask you, Scott. You will respond both as a scientist and as a dad. As a scientist, are there things that you research to think about the biology and the way someone might feel about that from a physiological standpoint?
Absolutely. I mean, I think that's a really good question for me as a scientist and a dad. As a scientist, it was pretty easy to accept, and that's because scientists know that animals don't have genders. In fact, I think there's 11 different animal species who are sex fluid in terms of they can change from a male to a female. My favorite example being the clownfish that, uh, based on, whatever is needed in the population, more males or females, it can transition from a male to a female, which is really interesting. And so I think gender fluidity in the animal kingdom is just a known scientific fact. And there are no, like in the animal kingdom, there's no set or universal gender roles. It's not that the mom always takes care of the kids. Sometimes the dad penguin takes care of the kids, where the mom goes off and gets fish. So as a scientist, I think it was much easier for me than as a dad, which I'm assuming is your next question.
No, I think that is very insightful, Scott, to say it's easier as a scientist than as a dad, because it questioned a lot of things about the family and your role as dad. And I'll get to that question later. But KJ, because Scott was going on, thinking about the animal kingdom and the like, and, the evolution of our species is, there's, as a scientist, kind of, I know, Scott, you think about how we evolved to where we are. We're not leaving some of those basic other animal type of, core foundations in us, right? We still have this quote unquote reptilian mind. The limbic brain system is one that is seen in reptiles, right? It's seen in other areas, and we shared 99% of our DNA strands with chimpanzees. So there's a connection. And it got me thinking about kind of evolution and the Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And KJ, I'll ask you, so the Maslow's hierarchy of needs, if you don't know it, and when you're listening to it, just look it up. But basically it's, there's food and shelter and water. But then as you start moving up in things that are really important for your survival. And a theory I can't prove is that there's a survival instinct in people, and that can manifest itself in a way because you have to survive as your most authentic person, and that some people don't, and they might have a life of where they feel like they were never themselves, or they missed out on what they needed. But there's an instinct, I think, to become our most natural self, and a drive to do that. And clearly your family provided a safe environment where you felt safe to do that, to be your most natural self, and to have that survival instinct and to engage in that. And I guess my question to you, KJ, is when did you realize that you needed to survive and you needed to be you versus other expectations of who you should be?
I think before my transition, I felt like I was living a life that didn't belong to me. So it's kind of like you're saying, I feel like I wasn't even surviving. It felt like that life wasn't as worth living because I was so disconnected from myself, and I felt like nobody knew who I really was. So I felt like I first had to go on that journey of figuring out what it looked like for me to survive and do more than surviving. Also, I had to think more about what I wanted to be seen as and who I was beyond other people's perceptions of me.
Mm-hmm. And when you were going through that, did you feel like making that choice there would be things that you would lose versus things that you would gain? Because clearly the gain of getting to be your most authentic self was, the draw and the choice. Were you afraid of losing something, though, with that choice?
I think I was afraid of losing acceptance from certain people and from society in general. Where I'm at now, like I no longer fit into a lot of the boxes that I fit into before that gave me privilege of being perceived as basically a cis woman, rather than now I'm not usually perceived as, I'm kind of perceived as gender ambiguous, and you lose certain privileges in that. And so I think that was something I was scared of losing. And I was scared of being who I was and having people not accept that. So things like getting misgendered and people intentionally misgendering me. So it's like I'm being out as who I am, but there's that chance that I'll get rejected as that person, that someone will through what they're saying or the way that they're acting will say, I'm not going to see you for who you say you are. So I'd say those
Mhm.
are my main fears.
It is an interesting thing. Societal norms have been around forever, and there's a history of art and stories of people who haven't followed societal norms. Heck, Galileo didn't follow societal norms, right? When he was talking about his revelation of the cosmology, he clearly was outside that. And it's very difficult, I think, for the general population to more easily uh, either accept or welcome a difference to the societal norm because it challenges their perspective of who they are, even more so than maybe who you might be. The interesting thing about this, though, is I think in 2024, well, in 2024 in Southern California, I think it is Pride Month, there is a greater understanding and acceptance of different ways to live. Are you feeling that that is true, or are you still feeling that there's an otherness that happens when people see you?
I think in the community that I'm in here in Bellingham and my immediate circles in kind of a college town, I pretty much always feel accepted for who I am and don't have a lot of fear about it. But that being said, I think in a larger scheme of things in the US and in the world, there's still a lot more progression that needs to happen in terms of trans rights. And right now, in a lot of states, there is currently this repeal of um, basically trans rights in a lot of states. So I think that we need to keep our eye out for that and advocate for those people in those states and also in other countries that are not being allowed to be who they are. And it's costing people lives, honestly. So,
Mhm.
yeah, I think in my community, I have the great privilege of having that acceptance, having that community, and not having a lot of fears that people in different areas might have. But I want to acknowledge that a lot of progress still needs to be made in that way, if that answers your
Sure. Yeah.
question. Yeah.
It's interesting. You've talked about two kinds of privileges now. One, the privilege of being a cis woman that you are going to be losing in terms of engaging with society as they might want you to be, and the privilege of living where you are and when you are. I think that human beings have been around a very long time. I think that gender identity and gender identity questions probably have been around as long as we've been humans. Just now we have a little bit more of the technology and the science to help make that happen. And maybe there's a little bit more of an acceptance. In Shakespeare's plays, they were talking about, cross-dressing and gender identity and gender changes and the like. So I don't think this is necessarily a new thing. I just think it's a little bit more accepted now. Scott, you are of a different generation than KJ, clearly. And in KJ's generation and Generation Z, it is by the census clearly shown that it's the most diverse generation in the country that we've ever had. There are lots of really interesting things about Gen Z in terms of the diversity and the talk about gender fluidity and the talk about different kinds of ways to express gender identity. And when my two daughters went to high school, they were coming home with new phrases that I'd never heard about. So we were having a hard time keeping up. So Scott, being of an older generation where these things, A, weren't talked about, and B, weren't talked about so casually and openly, how do you assess now the conversations that are happening, not only with your colleagues and friends, and your family, but in the world around you?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question for me, and I'm definitely not an expert to talk about that. But when I have conversations with others outside of my family about the transition that Kieran had made, I've always got his back. I've always, tried to put it in a positive way and for example, how much happier he is now being his authentic self. Um, I try to do a little bit of education, although, like I said, I'm not an expert, but I want to educate people as much as I can. Um, I'm reading some books occasionally. There's a book I would recommend, which is a really fun read called Mad Honey. And in that
Hmm.
book, there's one of the main characters has transitioned from uh, uh, a, a male to a female um, gender identity and gender, I guess. And that was really a cool book that I would recommend to people who really are curious about sort of like what's maybe inside the thoughts of someone going through those transitions or someone who's already made that transition.
Hmm. That's interesting. That's great feedback and it's helpful advice. I think one thing that is interesting too is we have always thrown these phrases about what it means to be a man. That's a very manly act,
Mm-hmm.
right? That's he's acting like a man. And oftentimes when we speak about these things of being masculine or men, it involves strength and courage, fortitude, decisiveness, right? These are all traits that people view as very manly traits. And of course, there are physical expressions like that. But I also think that if you take a look at it being more of a spiritual or personal choice where you exhibit strength and courage and fortitude and decisiveness, KJ, I would have to say if you use those phrases in those language, you actually made a very quote unquote manly decision to go against what other people might want you to be and to have the strength, fortitude, and decisiveness to create a life of your own.
Yeah, I think that's true, but I also think the traits that you listed can be embodied by anyone of any gender. I do feel like a lot of men feel this pressure to embody these traits in a certain way that's not always healthy and like pushing the traits to an extreme where it's like no longer a good thing. So I think you need to be careful around those ideas personally. I need to be careful around those. And I don't know if other people relate to that as well. But I do think that also these traits can be very positive things. And I think that I embody them in a positive way in a lot of ways. And I think that my dad does too, and people of all genders do. So,
Mm-hmm. It's interesting. I think in this discussion and in this generation, you know, gender is a very interesting idea where there's a biological gender, but there's a societal gender. And to Scott's point, I'm not as familiar with the terminology or the language or the current discussions, but what I think what is interesting though is that your relationship of with a father daughter and now father son. I'm curious if you guys could talk about that, right? And how it kind of changed your idea of sonhood and fatherhood. So KJ, I guess I'll start with you. How did you feel that change happening? Or maybe you didn't. Maybe you just had the relationship with your dad.
yeah, I don't feel like it changed that much because I feel like my dad always saw me as like just a soul, like a beautiful soul. I always say, like, I was thinking, I think about this a lot that me and my sister will wear these really weird outfits, like intentionally strange, and we'll ask my dad how we look, and he'll say, "You look great." And it's in such a genuine way. And it's just, I feel like he says that because he sees our souls. He's not seeing what we look like or what we present as. And so I don't feel like my relationship has changed that much, except for my transition being an opportunity to become closer with my dad and talk about these things that aren't as easy to talk about. Um,
Mm-hmm.
yeah, but I don't feel like he's treating me like a son, and before he was treating me like a daughter. I think I've just always been his kid, and it wasn't a super gendered treatment. It's just love and loving me as a soul.
That's fantastic. Scott, what was your take on that? Did you think about it differently or no?
No, I'm thinking about fatherhood differently, not because of the transition that Karen went through, but more from my own spiritual journey and recovery. That I'm really looking back on my past and examining, what kind of father I was, and thinking about what kind of father I want to be in the future as my own personal journey. But if I could go back just for a second about the definitions of manhood, strength, courage, fortitude, I really, embrace what you're doing here. So I love how you start off your podcast and you say, in regular life, men can be knuckleheads, but having strength and courage, it can be shown in many ways. It doesn't have to be on the battlefield or in the weight room or whatever. It can, sorry about the plane flying over, but it can be having the courage to have conversations like we're having today. And that's one of the reasons I'm really embracing doing this with you, is that I think it is a definition of maybe not just manhood, but, it is a definition of being courageous to talk more about things that I think men would often in the past just bury, and that wasn't healthy. I don't think that was
really
healthy.
You don't think burying your feelings is a good approach? I think no, I appreciate that, Scott, very much, and I think that your point about the courage to be vulnerable, because I think that any introspection happens because you are humble enough in your spirit and your soul and your thoughts to know that you don't know everything. And if you're humble enough to understand that you can learn something even from yourself or from other people, and you start that reflection and you start that introspection, you can go down a place that is very scary and uncertain. And for a lot of people that might feel really uncomfortable. But in another episode, I'll just give you the metaphor real quickly. It's an episode of a lobster. So I talk about, when you go through growth, right? So I watched this, undersea documentary, and there's, the old British guy says, the lobster outgrows its shell and has to eject the shell. And when it does, it moves under a rock for protection. And it was really, I was listening to it. And at the time, my daughter was being a teenager and going through hard stuff. But I was thinking, oh, this is so cool, because the lobster feels uncomfortable, ejects the shell, has to retreat and gather its strength. And then it grows a new shell. And what happens to the lobster? It's bigger. The lobster grew. And I told my daughter, I was like, I know this is a hard time, but you're lobstering. That's what's happening. You're growing, and it's uncomfortable. Growth is uncomfortable. And I guess maybe, KJ, when you were thinking about entering into this world of discomfort, but I don't know, KJ, I guess I'll ask you. You had mentioned you were uncomfortable because you weren't in your true self. And there's an inherent discomfort, like the shell was too tight.
Yeah, I think that's true. I think that any discomfort I experienced after transition is nothing compared to what I experienced before. I think that definitely the challenges were front loaded in terms of once I came out. It was like the first couple bits of that were the most difficult as I reconciled with people's perceptions of me and people having to change their perceptions of me. But where I'm at now, it's not even a problem in my mind at all. Like there's no uncomfortability because now everyone who's in my life has taken that time to accept me for who I am and understand me. And now I just get to be the way that I am as a new lobster. So it's pretty amazing.
I like that.
I have to say, KJ, that must feel like it's a tremendous amount of freedom.
It is. I would agree.
We'll be right back. Right, because I think that it is it's not everyone's path to embrace their true self. And I guess you are now at a place that's more joyful than you were before. So not just it's not just a gender transition, but it's a transition from discomfort to joy.
Definitely. And I think also with having to deal with expressing something that people might not accept or understand has made me more comfortable with that in other aspects of my life too. Just being in ways that, like being the way that I am in other ways, whether people like it or not. So it's kind of cool that my gender transition and those tough experiences that came with it have given me this growth and this gift of not being as afraid to express myself in all these different ways and knowing that no matter what, people will have things to say about it, good and bad, and you just have to be the way that you are.
Mm-hmm. There's another episode I talked with a brilliant man named Lars, and I forget the name of the book, but it was written by a Holocaust survivor. And he was talking about the space that he created between himself and the Nazi oppressors in the concentration camp. And that in that space, he created this place where they couldn't touch him, right? This mental and spiritual place where the arrows couldn't get past the wall. Are you finding that, and I think you just mentioned it, are you finding that you've created that space so that your comfort with who you are now is kind of a fortress against any arrows someone might send your way?
Yeah, not to that level of intensity, obviously. That sounds like a really intense book and experience. But I do think that there was a point where that wall had completely crumbled, I think post transition, where I was so scared and there was so much of that pressure on me to be who other people expect me to be. And I was feeling still that judgment from people after I came out. But I think after that, there was a rebuilding of that wall because I realized, wow, I actually still feel so great, even with all these people disrespecting who I am or this and that. It's like, at least I'm being honest. At least I'm being honest. And that's what I can control. And so I think then from there, I was able to build the wall back up because I was like, I know who I am. And if you don't understand that, that's your problem.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's an interesting thing about control, because this is something that was in your control. And I guess, Scott, I'll ask you as a scientist, you know that there are experiments that are controlled and experiments that you can't. When you started to see KJ go through this transition, were you expecting something methodical? Were you expecting something chaotic? Did you expect anything at all?
Wow. What was I expecting? I wasn't expecting chaos. I can say that for sure. But I wasn't expecting a methodical transition either. Um, Somewhere in between those two extremes, and I, it happened at a time uh, right before KJ went off to college, and so we kept in touch about the average amount that a you know father
Mm-hmm.
son keeps in contact with someone who's in college. Um, and I don't know. Maybe KJ felt it was a little bit chaotic. Maybe not. I'm not a person. It's one thing about me. I don't have expectations. I try to live. I have expectations of myself, but I try not to project expectations onto others.
Hmm.
So I have a difficult time just basically answering that question.
No, that makes I get you. I mean, the idea of, but that's unusual that you didn't necessarily have an expectation on others. It's almost like you didn't have an expectation of who your child should be, instead letting your child decide who the child should be themselves.
Yeah, I'm definitely a proponent of letting the child decide who they should be.
Mm-hmm. KJ, did you always feel that way about yourself and your dad as you were growing up?
Yeah, I feel like that's true. Um, I was reading through Dad's conversation guide, and there was one thing I was surprised to hear on it is that he had a hard time with one thing in terms of this aspect. He had a hard time with letting me stop taking piano lessons. But I did not pick up on that at all. So I guess that's the only thing. Um, in which maybe he wanted me, he had that sense of wanting to control and wanting me to continue piano lessons. But that's so small, first of all. And second of all, I didn't even realize it at the time, because he was at least externally offering me that acceptance of and giving me that choice to do what I wanted to do. So I would say I did always feel that from my dad. And like I never had to do anything in particular to make him proud. He was just inherently proud of me.
That's beautiful, to be inherently proud. And I guess some folks might say that, that there's a balance of letting the kids do whatever they want versus putting guidance, control, being more hands-on. Scott, how do you reconcile that balance when you look back about how hands-on you were or were not?
Yeah. So when I look back and when KJ was going through, middle school and early high school years, um, I don't want to get too specific, but there was something wrong that we didn't know the reasons for, which later we learned, that KJ was not being his authentic self. And I have some regrets about not being more hands-on back then. When I look back on it, um, I think I could have been more helpful, and this is one of the reasons for having this conversation is to get a few things like the piano lessons out in the open and talk about it. And I hope it's like this isn't the only conversation we're going to have, obviously, but it's definitely a starter for us to ask the question of how could I have been more helpful and more hands-on, and would that have helped, or would it have just caused more angst? And I don't know. I don't know the answers to those questions.
I don't either. I think that those are unanswerable questions. When you look back in the past, I guess, KJ, the impression that I have is that you felt very comfortable with your dad's level of involvement and comfortable pulling him in or comfortable getting the space. Is that a correct assumption, or am I misreading that?
I think that I know I could reach out to my dad anytime that I wanted to, but I do think like I can't go without saying that I feel like because of the dynamic of like my dad being at work and my mom being the stay-at-home parent, it became a kind of default for me to reach out to my mom instead of
Mm-hmm.
my dad. And that's something that I want to work on because it's still something that I default to. And I do think, going back to my dad's previous podcast, there were nights when he was out later and my mom was home. So that kind of perpetuated that wanting to reach out to my mom versus my dad. But there was never any point where I was like, I can't reach out to my dad. Like I always knew that I could talk to him and tell him things and that he would be receptive to it. It's just a matter of habit, I think.
I think that's right. I think that there are habits that we get, that we develop early on and a little bit ingrained. And like, my daughters would talk to me about certain things and talk to my wife about other things. And then it's just kind of based on their comfort level or availability or even skills, right? My wife is much better at talking about certain things than I am, and vice versa. And I think that's natural. So I guess the question is, what kind of conversations are you guys having now? When you kind of compare notes as to how you're moving on? Because KJ, you mentioned that you're moving to Los Angeles, a small little coastal sleepy town in Southern California in September, from the wild, crazy metropolis of Bellingham. Are you guys having these conversations now?
Should I go first or KJ?
Go ahead, Dad.
Whoever wants to jump in.
I think the answer is yes. We are comparing notes. This was a nice springboard in terms of conversation guides and, communications we've had around this conversation. And, I want to continue. I have a strong drive to continue these conversations and talk about, everything from relationships to, professional life and I want to be more involved in KJ's life, and that's one of my goals for the future.
That's great.
Yeah, I'm happy to hear that. I feel like it's still feeling all new to me because recently my dad called me to make amends for his AA program. And that one of the things he talked about was apologizing for not being there for me and like my mental health struggles in high school a lot. And so I think that since then, that was just one of the many things he said that kind of opened up the conversation. And I could see that, Dad, that you wanted to be more vulnerable now and to know more about my life. And I also know more about your life. So I think that was pretty recently, like a month ago. So I'm feeling very excited for what's to come.
That's wonderful, you guys. Because you're both going through another type of transition, where KJ, your sonhood is now evolving to where you're a young adult. And Scott, your fatherhood is now evolving to where you have a young adult. It's a different relationship than what it was when you're a child. I guess, Scott, I'll ask you this first, and then KJ, I'll ask you the same question. So, Scott, what are you learning from KJ?
Wow. I'm learning a lot about what the word gender means. Like when you dive deep into the word gender, especially in today's the way we define it today or the way we might define it in the future, there's a whole spectrum of meanings and conversations that one can have around gender. And I never thought of gender as a social construct, but now I do. So that's one of the things I've learned. And it's very eye-opening to think about gender that way. And it's just the tip of the iceberg, actually, but that's where a lot of the learning starts, is accepting that, that humans have been programmed over years and years of evolution to think a certain way. And now I think we're able to change those thought patterns, but they change really slowly.
Yes.
And um,
It's interesting you mentioned that you didn't think much about gender um, without even knowing it or meaning to do this. I don't know, just your family evolved that way. You had a quote unquote traditional family structure. You went to work, mom stayed home, she raised the children, you came home from work. Um, Maybe that's just how the family played out, but maybe that you didn't even think about gender in that way, right? In terms of those quote unquote traditional roles.
right. My wife and I agreed that that was a really good thing to, we both agreed to that. And it wasn't an easy thing for my wife to not work. That was actually
Right.
hard for her. And now she's working and really happily, working, doing her own business. So I want to throw that in there.
Yeah.
That's really a good thing. So maybe we're less traditional now. I don't know. Anyway, um, I think that, we love our kids so much, and um, Audrey was having some difficulty in school, and it made sense for actually her to be homeschooled one year, which actually
Mm-hmm.
led to my wife's new career, and doing some tutoring at our home. Um, so it wasn't about gender roles. It was more about what works for us and what's
What works for
important.
the family? No,
What works for
I
the family.
see you. I see you that because what works for a family might be different from others. My wife also stopped working. She had a terrific career and she opted out so that she would stay home with the kids. And she struggled because I think most really smart, intelligent women who have a career bent have a challenge when they feel confined if they're at home. And that was a choice that she made. It wasn't easy at all.
Yeah.
And I think that we're rethinking that now, especially the younger generations are rethinking that, where there's less, I don't know, less of a expectation of what that division should be. We'll be right back. So KJ, you're the younger generation. You're moving into, your young adulthood. So I'll ask you two questions. The first one, though, is what are you learning from your dad?
Hmm. I feel like one thing I've learned from my dad is there are so many things to be joyful about. I think
Mm.
he really embodies that even on some of his most stressful days. Like, I feel like he would come home and we'd dance around when I was younger. We'd dance around with like washcloths and play like swing dance music. And I think that I carry that sense of like adventure and of making any day a little bit more lively and joyful. I carry that with me now. And yeah, there's nothing like the way that my dad is joyful. Like it just brings a smile to my face to think about it. And so I think that joy can be created and found in any day. Maybe it means going for a swim. Maybe it means dancing in the kitchen after work, which are both things that I have done as a kid and things that I do now. So
Mm-hmm.
that's one thing I've learned from him. And I think also the way that he accepts people, myself included, but also he'll talk to really strangers that I would perceive as really weird and be like, I'm not going to talk to that stranger. They'll start talking to him and he just accepts them and is really friendly and keeps the conversation going with them. And I think it reminds me to not be so judgmental and to just accept people as they are.
Oh, you know what? I love that because you hope that people aren't judgmental of you and accepts you how you are. And so that takes that to your own self to treat others that same way.
Exactly.
So now you're entering your young adulthood, KJ. Do you have a plan for what you want to do in the next 3 to 5 years, or are you open to letting it unfold? How is that going to work for you?
I'm open to letting it unfold. I think I am about to graduate actually this week, so I'm in a very classically
Congratulations. Well done.
thank you. Thank you. Yeah, so I'm in a very classically uncertain point in my life. All I know is that I'm going to get some kind of job in LA and live with my sister. And I'm hoping that job is in some kind of public service or nonprofit. I've spent a lot of time working with people with disabilities. That's what my current job is. So perhaps something on that vein, but I'm also open to whatever opportunities present. And I think that there's something a little bit exciting about this uncertain time in my life. And I just have to accept that I can't know where I'm headed right now.
Yeah, I think that's great. There's it's an interesting thing because you've got to live your own life, and there's no one way to live. There's no prescription of 4 years college, get a job as soon as you're out, then you move in your career, and then you get married. There's nothing like that actually exists, and we all have to figure out our own way to go. And I love that you're excited about the uncertainty of what would unfold. But it seems to me, I might be wrong, and if I am, and if it's a misstep, please forgive me. But it seems to me that you've gained a lot of confidence from the choice to transition, and that confidence can help you, I think, in every part of your life, and that you can figure out this next step yourself.
Thank you. That means a lot to hear you say that. I do think that, yeah, I agree that my transition has given me a sense of confidence that I might not have found otherwise, or it would have taken me a lot longer to find it. So, yeah, I definitely agree with what you're saying.
That's fantastic. So I guess one of the things that I know to be true is I've been having conversations with other families and friends, and your story of transition is not as uncommon as it has been even 10 years ago, 5 years ago. I guess, Scott, I'll start with you and then KJ, you. So, Scott, what would you say to other parents whose child is experiencing this type of transition?
Yeah, I would say try to embrace it um, and start right away by supporting being gender affirming and using the correct pronouns. It's not easy to do that, or at least it wasn't easy for me, but it definitely has a large impact on the person receiving, your correct language or incorrect language. I know from having conversations with KJ that that's a big deal at the beginning. And what else would I say? I would say that they should really come to their own conclusions about what the word gender means. Read about it. Consider what it means to them, and even consider that it is a social construct. When you think about it, I think that's something. I would be surprised if a deep thinking parent didn't come to that conclusion themselves. And if they came to the opposite conclusion, then they're not being open-minded enough.
KJ, what would you say to the family, the parents, or the person transitioning? What any kind of advice or what story would you tell them?
For parents and family members, I would say really similar to what my dad said, that acceptance is really the greatest gift that you can give them. That's like the number one thing that I felt that I needed when I came out. So just listening to their experiences without judgment, validating them, using that gender affirming language, like correct pronouns and everything. And also, yes, it will probably take you time to adjust to the perception of your kid who's transitioning, to adjust your perception to a correct one. But take that time and just know that they're still the same soul. It's only that they're becoming a more truer and like happier version of themselves. And then to the person or the kid transitioning, I would say that like trust yourself, trust your feelings. Don't listen to what other people have to say about who you are, because you're the one who knows best. And I would also say that find other people like you, find other people that are trans or queer, and that finding those people who can not only accept you, but understand your experience, can share that experience with you is so important. So try to find that and make those connections, because that community is important in addition to your family. But yeah, I love all the trans kids out there, and I hope you know that you're beautiful and that I see you just as you are.
Excellent. That's wonderful. Wonderful. I'm going to actually ask one final question for each of you, because Scott, you had mentioned that you're on a particular faith journey and that you're at a different stage of your faith journey. KJ, what kind of faith journey are you on? I know in the early 20s, it's going to be different than someone who's in their mid 50s or 60s and the like. Do you think about your faith journey?
Yeah, I do. I think it's very like up and down for me in terms of the consistency of my spiritual practices, but I do feel like there's kind of a consistent everyday, at least for me, everyday pondering of what it means to be here. And I find that every day kind of feels more real to me than the day before. It's hard to describe, but I feel like I'm seeing more than I did the day previously and understanding more. And I think that I want to be better about having some kind of more a regimen like my dad has of meditation or something. But I do think at this hectic chapter in my life, I'm kind of focusing on pondering, and when signs need to come to me personally, I find that they do come to me. And yeah, I think that there is definitely a lot of uncertainty and lack of consistency on my spiritual journey right now. But I think I can feel myself growing. And I also think that when that needs to find me, it will. And when that consistency needs to happen, it will. I'm not sure if that's correct. Maybe I need to be putting in more initiative to meditate and whatnot. But I do feel like I've been growing spiritually without even trying. It's just kind of something that's like a given to me if I'm receptive to it. And I think that any person and any day can be seen as a lesson. Honestly, especially the bad ones, like especially a person I might have trouble with, or a day that is just a struggle. Like I can either see that as just something that's beating me into the ground and it just sucks, or I can see it as, what is this teaching me? What is this trying to tell me right now? And whether I think it's God or chance or whatever, I think that seeing every day and every person as a lesson has been really valuable to my own growth spiritually and personally.
That's wonderful. And I think that's great to be open, because faith journeys are so ambiguous for so many folks. And at sometimes, even with their certain, there are moments of uncertainty and doubt that happens with every good faith journey. And the reason I asked you, KJ, is because a couple of times you've mentioned that your dad especially saw the soul of you. That's a very intentional word. That's a spiritual word, right? So there's a spiritual component in terms of how you think about people. That's why I asked about that from a faith journey perspective, because beyond the shell of what we are and what people see, there's a soul that's there. So thank you. I thought that was a terrific and very thoughtful response for someone in their early 20s, especially the idea that there's no correct way to live a faith journey, unless you're an asshole and you use your faith. But the idea of being open to learning more is really, I think, what so much of it's all about. Scott, has this experience made you a more faithful person?
I think so. I'm going through the transition from, focused on the day-to-day work, my job, to thinking about retirement. And I've been talking to a lot of people about retirement, and everybody pretty much says the same thing, which is, think about what you want to do. Think about something you can volunteer your time doing, right? And I really, I think the future of my faith-based journey is whatever it is that I volunteer for. I want to be volunteering to help underserved populations, whether that be people who don't have homes, or immigrants, or people who are displaced by natural disasters. I feel like, expanding my fellowship beyond just, my recovery group and my friends and people in my family, but really branching out to a larger population,
larger community. Yeah,
just
that's wonderful.
So that I'm looking forward to that as part of my future spiritual journey.
That's great. Well, gents, this has been a marvelous discussion. I really appreciate both of you being a part of this and sharing your stories. I think it takes a lot of courage on both of your parts, not only to go through what you guys have gone through, but to share your story with all of us. And I couldn't be more appreciative and grateful for you to spend the time. So thank you.
Chris, thank you for having us on. And again, thanks for establishing this podcast. I think it's a wonderful thing. And I'm definitely a big fan of yours. So keep it up.
Thanks.
Yeah, agreed. Thank you so much for having us.
Wonderful. All right. Have a great night.
You too.
Well, what an incredible conversation. What a brave conversation. And it's not a political conversation. It's not a social conversation. A little bit of that came up, but really this is a conversation with a father and a conversation with that father's child. And it's a conversation of a father and a son. I hope that you listen to this with an open heart and a wide mind. I hope that you learned something about how fathers and sons can go through their own transitions, and it can be different than yours, but you can allow them to be their own. So what did we learn from the two of them? We learned that transitions happen in fathers and sons and in ways that we don't know, but they happen in a way that can bring joy to both. Remember, we all started as a female in the embryo. We have no idea of the science of a gender role versus the biology. And I'll leave that for the other people to figure out. All I know is that they're figuring out their relationship, and I'm grateful that they shared it with all of us. And I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you enjoy this podcast. I'd love for you to book a conversation. You can visit menfolkjourneys.com and find a conversation starter and book a conversation. I hope you've learned and see from the different episodes that I make it comfortable, I make it meaningful, and I make conversations create a moment for you to think about your own life and the journey you've done and the journey you're on now and the journey you're going to be. So visit menfolkjourneys.com, book a conversation, because I know you have a great story to share, and if you share your story, we can learn from it, and we can all get better together. Word bit Philared.